the last topic that I do want to cover, and it's a sensitive one, so I want to be careful on how I approach this. But I think one of the responsibilities of journalists is to cover topics that are uncomfortable, that aren't always popular, that people don't always want to hear. But I think they need to be done sensitively, understanding context. One of the areas that True North has covered is Indian residential schools and what's gone on, and some op-eds have been going in. And so I'm just wondering about the coverage of those topics, what your thoughts are on that, and how we kind of have this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. And it's definitely a sensitive topic, just because I think that there's like an elephant in the room, and there's a problem in our society when it comes to how Canada has historically and systematically, I don't want to say dealt with, but the relationship that they have with the Native people in Canada, the people who were here before, the Europeans came, the Brits came and developed a country. And I think that there's like a much, much, much deeper problem with the way that our government has created. There's a broad problem, and we can get into that for sure. But when it comes to the issue of residential schools and the unmarked graves story that came out, look, again, I'm a journalist, and I treat things with like a great deal of skepticism. I pay close attention to the news, so I read the news every day. I read every outlet, basically like front to cover, front to back. I like to see what's out there. And so when the story first broke of the 215 unmarked graves that were discovered in Kamloops, I read this story like 25 times. And as a journalist, I went to the original source. It's like, it was a CBC story. And I'm like, where is this coming from? Because the story didn't make sense to me the way I read it. It was basically like, this tribe put out a press release, and this is what the press release claims. And there was no like deeper questioning about it. It was just like, this happened, this is what they said, and here we go. And so I went and I read the original press release, and I tried to figure out like, what evidence do they have? Like they're coming out and they're saying that they discovered 215 bodies basically, and they're saying that they're children as young as 2. But like, what is the evidence here? Like what prompted this press release? Like, why is it? And it's like, okay, they used something called ground penetrating radar, and they found disturbances, approximately 215 disturbances. And so I'm just trying to like make sense of the story. And then all of a sudden I start looking at like the international reaction and the national reaction in Canada. And it was just so mismatched. It was like I was like, am I losing my sense of sanity here? Because I started looking into, started talking to other professors who understood this ground penetrating radar and what it is and what it does. The purpose of the technology is to discover abandoned like oil wells, so that they can like reclaim them. So it's a really rudimentary technology. Anyway, all of a sudden, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and CNN are saying that Canada committed genocide, and that there's mass graves, and there's hundreds of children discovered, and the bodies were exhumed, and that they have evidence and proof. And it's like, well, that's not what the First Nation's saying. The First Nation is just saying that they have preliminary evidence, and there's no report yet, and the report is coming out like in 6 months. So it just seemed to me that there was like a total mismatch between the information that we had that was confirmed and the narrative and the story. And then all of a sudden you had all this contrition and all these grieving people. And I think that's what came from like the broader issue, the deeper issue in Canada of like how Canada has had the relationship that it's had with the Native people of this land. That basically Canadians just feel really bad about the situation, and they're willing to accept anything that's said. Like, okay, your government was evil. This program was awful. It was basically concentration camps, and you committed genocide. And it's like, that accusation is not backed up by history, by records, by any previous, Truth and Reconciliation Commission or any data that we have out there. But Canadians are kind of like willing to accept it because they just feel awful about our history and and what's happening. And I just think, okay, it's important to correct the record and have the truth out there. Like there were no bodies that were discovered. Maybe there will be, but like there's no missing children. There's no if there were children that were murdered at residential schools, we would know about it. We would have their names, we would have their records, we would have their birth records. And so the whole story just kind of got taken away. And so At first we were super careful and sensitive.
The last topic that I do want to cover, and it's a sensitive one, so I want to be careful on how I approach this. But I think one of the responsibilities of journalists is to cover topics that are uncomfortable, that aren't always popular, that people don't always want to hear. But I think they need to be done sensitively, understanding context. One of the areas that True North has covered is Indian residential schools and what's gone on, and some op-eds have been going in. And so I'm just wondering about the coverage of those topics, what your thoughts are on that, and how we kind of have this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it. And it's definitely a sensitive topic just because I think that there's an elephant in the room, and there's a problem in our society when it comes to how Canada has historically and systematically, I don't want to say dealt with, but the relationship that they have with the Native people in Canada, the people who were here before, the Europeans came, the Brits came and developed a country. And I think that there's a much, much, much deeper problem with the way that our government has created there's a broad problem, and we can get into that for sure. But when it comes to the issue of residential schools and the unmarked graves story that came out, look, again, I'm a journalist and I treat things with a great deal of skepticism. I pay close attention to the news, so I read the news every day. I read every outlet, basically front to cover, front to back. I like to see what's out there. And so when the story first broke of the 215 unmarked graves that were discovered in Kamloops, I read this story 25 times. And as a journalist, I went to the original source. It was a CBC story. And I'm like, where is this coming from? Because the story didn't make sense to me the way I read it. It was basically this tribe put out a press release, and this is what the press release claims. And there was no deeper questioning about it. It was just this happened, this is what they said, and here we go. And so I went and I read the original press release, and I tried to figure out what evidence do they have. They're coming out and they're saying that they discovered 215 bodies, basically, and they're saying that they're children as young as 2. But what is the evidence here? What prompted this press release? Why is it? And it's okay, they used something called ground penetrating radar. And they found disturbances, approximately 215 disturbances. And so I'm just trying to make sense of the story. And then all of a sudden I start looking at the international reaction and the national reaction in Canada. And it was just so mismatched. It was I was am I losing my sense of sanity here? Because I started looking into, started talking to other professors who understood this ground penetrating radar and what it is and what it does. The purpose of the technology is to discover abandoned oil wells, so that they can reclaim them. So it's a really rudimentary technology. Anyway, all of a sudden, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and CNN are saying that Canada committed genocide, and that there's mass graves, and there's hundreds of children discovered, and the bodies were exhumed, and that they have evidence and proof. And it's well, that's not what the First Nation's saying. The First Nation is just saying that they have preliminary evidence, and there's no report yet, and the report is coming out in 6 months. So it just seemed to me that there was a total mismatch between the information that we had that was confirmed and the narrative and the story. And then all of a sudden you had all this contrition and all these grieving people. And I think that's what came from the broader issue, the deeper issue in Canada of how Canada has had the relationship that it's had with the Native people of this land. That basically Canadians just feel really bad about the situation, and they're willing to accept anything that's said. Okay, your government was evil. This program was awful. It was basically concentration camps, and you committed genocide. And it's that accusation is not backed up by history, by records, by any previous, Truth and Reconciliation Commission or any data that we have out there. But Canadians are kind of willing to accept it because they just feel awful about our history and what's happening. And I just think, okay, it's important to correct the record and have the truth out there. There were no bodies that were discovered. Maybe there will be, but there's no missing children. There's no if there were children that were murdered at residential schools, we would know about it. We would have their names, we would have their records, we would have their birth records. And so the whole story just kind of got taken away. And so At first we were super like careful and sensitive, and I understand that's a very sensitive topic. I also just think it's bad for people to believe something that's not true. It's not a good thing for First Nations children to grow up in Canada believing that they were the victim of a genocide, if it's not true. Believe that they were sent off to schools to get murdered, and that like priests and teachers were killing children and then burying them in the middle of the night. Like, that story is just so it's wild. It's so emotionally driven. And if there's evidence of it, and it turns out that is what happened, then we should know that, and that should be part of our recorded history. But like one news report in the middle of the summer with an accusation in a press release doesn't change like all of the recorded history that we have. And so, like I said, at first we just wrote a story here and there questioning like, well, this is what we know so far. This is what's been verified. There's no mass graves, right? There's no bodies that have been uncovered. There's been new excavations. And then after we started writing that, we attracted some sort of like more academic people, like university professors, historians, people who really knew the issue deeply. And we just published a book called Grave Error, which is a compilation of essays from these professors who sort of look at the records, the records of enrollment in these schools. They look at the number of children who did sadly die during their time at residential schools, the cause of death, the reason. We have the records. It's not like it's just like a big black hole mystery. Like, we know how many kids died at school. We know their cause of death. And yeah, just looking at the actual policy of residential schools, like for instance, it was never compulsory. It was never mandatory. At most, maybe a quarter of First Nations children ever went to these schools. So just sort of bringing some facts into the story. And I obviously want to preface this all, Aaron, by saying that obviously there's a problem in Canada. Like, I grew up in Vancouver and went to high school in Campbell River, and there's a couple of native reserves in Campbell River. And, it was kind of shocking to me to see how like different it was, that there was like a high school where like half the kids lived in Campbell River and the other half lived on native reserves, and then they came into Campbell River. Like, the difference between the native reserves and the kids that lived in Campbell River, like it still strikes me as odd that we have this kind of like segregated system. And I think that there's a lot of problems in it. And I think that the Canadian government has made a lot of mistakes along the way. I mean, the conversation we were having earlier about how government creates more problems than it solves, and more government problems and more government programs and social programs usually don't actually help the people that they intend to help. They actually hurt them. This is all kind of like part of my criticism of having a big, strong federal government, a big liberal government. But when it comes to that story of the unmarked graves, it just frankly isn't true.
To pull this back, though, a lack of evidence isn't evidence itself. And to the point of like the impact of that story, it and the 215 has resulted in a significant amount of funding. And I'm in the Stolo territory, and our area has received funding to do that research, to go through the areas where they believe there may be unmarked graves. So there could be more information coming as a consequence of a story that might not have been aired exactly accurately, to your point, but there may be benefits for the communities, because if nobody knew, there wouldn't be a lot of funding to look into this. Now, because it's a national conversation, there's funding available to do the research we need to do. But
do you think that, I mean, I'm sorry, are you going to find something like there's funding in your area to try to find bodies of kids that may have been killed in these residential schools? Like do you have the names of the kids that are missing? Like what kids are you looking for?
The children, the concern that I would have is when you point to records, and the individual Rodney Clifton who wrote the article was like, well, why isn't there any chief and council who've come forward with requests? Well, like, I'm on council for my community. We are behind. We're 2 years behind on our audits. We're trying to figure out how to address our housing issues. Like, we are not sitting in a room like, hey, what should we draft a BCR, a band council resolution about today? We are working to address so many issues, and we're treated like a municipality with very little funding. And so when he made that comment, it was like, maybe you don't understand how band councils work, but most of the time we're behind and overwhelmed with all the problems that we're trying to deal with. And so to the point of like which kids, we're talking about over 100 years. So certainly some of those records, A, could be falsified, B, not everybody may have been documented, and C, if a child did pass away, the fact that they could falsify those records or not have documented some people coming into those schools to begin with would be some of the problems with the claims that there's no evidence for these children. And so many of the parents, again, being a sensitive topic, they had no faith that anybody would care. There was a well understanding, even locally, that if the Indian agent said something, you did it. And if you didn't, you had a problem. We have spots in the Lower Mainland where Indigenous people were hanged, and so the power imbalance during that period would not have led people to rush in and go, oh, I'm sure journalists care about what our circumstances are. For so many Canadians, they had no idea Indian residential schools even existed, and that's now being taught. But to think that anybody cared about these problems 50 years ago, 100 years ago is kind of foolhardy. So when I saw that, it was like, well, maybe we're not putting in ourselves into the context of what those times may have had on people.
But you're conflating times too, right? Like when you're talking about how there were First Nations or Natives that were hung in the Lower Mainland, like I'm sure, I mean, do you know the dates that happened? My guess is it was in the 1800s. Like when we're talking about residential schools, most of them opened like interwar period. Like we're talking about like the 30s to the 60s, right? Or maybe the 20s to the 60s. First of all, the 20s were a time when the Spanish plague it killed a quarter of the global population, right? Like the average, 1 in 4 children were surviving to the age of 18, right? So like people just died a lot more frequently back then. But
people celebrated. Joseph Trutch within our region, he said the extinction of Indigenous people will come at the consequence of many of these diseases, so they're not a problem to worry about, which is why he downsized Indian reserves, which Douglas gave anticipatory reserves to. So the kind of overall ethos during that period was that all these people are going to die anyway, so we don't have to worry about them. So it wasn't like there was a lot of love for Indigenous people during some of the periods we're talking about.
Well, okay, so I was talking about in an entire population, not just First Nations. Like everyone was dying from the Black Plague, right? People were dying, and I'm sure you can find awful quotes because it was a different time when people had different views. I'm sure you could find quotes from First Nations people saying awful, horrible, racist things about white people too, and you can find awful, horrible quotes about white people. Like I don't think that the two sides had the best relations back then, and I think that
one had all the power and one had none of the power.
Yeah, there's definitely like regrettable circumstances. But Aaron, I'm talking about like the fact that there's claims that there were hundreds of children that were murdered in these schools, but we don't know the names of those kids. Like we don't know who they are. Like, I mean, I'm saying this as a mother. Like if I send my kids off to school and they don't come home, like I'm not just going to say like, oh well, no one cares anyway. So I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to go along. Like if something happens to your children, you're going to let it know, even if it's just in your community. Like you're going to have a record that your child died at a school. Like even if it's just that you keep that record in your community, maybe you don't go tell the white sheriff down the street because you don't trust him. But the idea that there's just all of these children that were murdered by nuns and priests and teachers, like you say, like a lack of an evidence is an evidence. That's one of the worst accusations that you can level against another human being.
But it's not against a human being. It's against a broader system, right? It's not one. I'm not saying this guy was responsible, which to your point would be incredibly disrespectful. It's that the system would have caused these deaths, these people working within the system. I actually have a lot of sympathy for the individuals who worked with them. We do know that many of the people who wanted to work in Indian residential schools over the past 100 years were not the most well-intentioned individuals. That going up into the middle of nowhere and working with kids was not something many people wanted to do, and some of them had perverse incentives, dark incentives, and harmful ideas on what they would be able to do if they ran those.
So like so the government recruited a bunch of murderers to go off and like kill kids. Like I just am trying to understand the accusation because again, like because we're writing about this, is a super controversial topic. I've 100%. Heard from a lot of Canadians. I really respect what you're saying, and I'm happy to continue this conversation as long as you want, because I think I can learn from you in this instance because you're a lot more connected to it than I. But I've heard from people who say, there was an Indian residential school in my community, and they got more money than the public schools or the Catholic schools, and they had more resources, and they had better teachers, and they had nicer buildings. And I've talked to people who were graduates of these residential schools, and they say that it changed their life and it made them on a better path towards succeeding in a modern economy. So like there's two sides to it, right? It's like, I'm sure a lot of people went to school and had a miserable experience, and they were homesick and they were sad. A lot of people really wanted their children to attend these schools because they saw it as an opportunity for betterment. Like I said, the schools weren't compulsory. They weren't mandatory. They weren't going and scooping people up from their house, despite there's a sort of a thought that was happening, that the Canadian police were like going door to door and scooping kids up and taking them to these schools. That's a myth as far as I can understand. People wanted the schools, and sure, like in any environment, there's going to be an abuse of power. There was abuse, and there was horrible, unspeakable abuse, and it's tragic. And anyone who was involved in that should be held accountable. There's a reason we got rid of this program. It obviously failed. It didn't work, although some people did benefit from it.
But fair to say that churches have had a system to protect their own, not just with Indigenous people, but there's documentaries about how they've moved people around to avoid the exact accountability that you're describing.
What churches?
There's man, off the top of my head, there's a Netflix documentary called like Mother something, and she was a nun and she worked within the system. And
in Canada?
In the US.
Okay.
And that she was murdered, and that a few of her colleagues were murdered, and that the priest, they have documentation that he was committing these atrocities. They have documentation that churches knew, and that they were deliberately moving him around. I can't remember the name of the documentary off the top of my head, but like this isn't controversial that this has happened.
Yeah, I think that there's been abuses in power, and they used to happen at churches, and now they happen in other places. I just think we should be careful about clinging and jumping to this narrative. Like, I mean, for you as I don't know, you're Native, your First Nations.
Yes, yeah, from Chihuahua First Nation. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to like mislabel you, because in Campbell River, all my friends who were Native, they would call themselves Native or
I'm fine
Indian.
with that term. I'm also against the political correct nature of, like, I don't care if you.
I just don't want to like offend you or be insensitive.
No, you won't offend me, I promise.
Like, if it were my community and all of a sudden they were like, hey, Candice, like my family's English and British and we've been in Canada for 300 years. If all of a sudden they told me like, you were the victim of this like horrific atrocity that may or may not have happened, and you're a victim, like for my community, I wouldn't want to walk around with that mantle of I'm a victim. And one of the things I noticed when the Unmarked Grave story came out and I questioned it, were like people were really angry and attacking me. A lot of them were First Nations people, or Native people, who just were like, F you stupid idiot, shut up. You try to kill us. You're settler. You're illegitimate here. Like just really nasty stuff. And I saw the pain that they had, and I felt for them. It's like they're told that they're a victim. They're told that the society that they live in tried to systematically eliminate them, like genocide them, murder them, mass murder them. That kids in schools, like their parents and grandparents, would go to school and get murdered. Like, how are you setting these kids up to be successful citizens in a society? Forget about like verifying facts and how many kids died and whether it happened or whether it didn't happen. But it's like, if like this narrative that's being pushed, telling little First Nations kids that their country tried to kill them, and that Canada is an illegitimate settler state, and that you want to have the land back. So you're going to like get these awful white people off the land and give it all back, and have this like utopian idea that someday you'll go back to like living freely in the forests with like Mother Nature and having this like beautiful life. Like that's just never going to happen, right? And it's such a bad message to tell little kids. Like I think that the messages surrounding First Nations should be much more empowering. Like we should talk about how like incredible it is that these people lived off the land, and how they were warriors, and how they fought for their kin, and how the men were strong and they took care of their families, and how the women like raised children, and in these communities, like I want the stories around Canadian First Nations to be like positive, triumphant stories of victory. And instead, what I see in the media is just like these sad stories of like, okay, let's interview a guy who's like who like brother committed suicide at a residential school, and like this is going to be the face of First Nations. He's drug addicted and he's got alcoholism, and it's like the people that they're holding up. It's like it's just such a sad message to be sending to a community, and I just think we can do better than that. Like I don't want that message that Canada committed genocide, which is not, the records don't show that. Like I have yet to see a government policy that says, let's just murder them all, let's kill them all, and here's how we're going to do it. Like that's just not part of our history. I don't think that we should write it in. And I mean, as far as mistreatment of First Nations people at residential schools, yes, that's very well documented. It's also well documented that a lot of the experiences were positive, right? So overall, bad system, gone. Glad we don't do it anymore, right? At the same time, let's not like invent things about the history that probably didn't happen just for the sake of like getting some more money for your band so that you can do some research that may or may not lead to anything. Like from my knowledge, there's been a handful of excavations carried out in First Nations communities across Canada, cost millions of dollars to the Canadian taxpayers. No human remains have been found, none. No human remains. So the places where people believe that there could be bodies buried, the few places where they allow them to exhume the bodies, there's nothing there. And it's like, eventually they're going to find something. Sure, eventually you're going to find a body. I mean, it's a big country and there are people living here and people die. But, you know, some of the news stories, Aaron, that came out afterwards, it was like, you know, there's a place where they found 715 unmarked graves in a community in Saskatchewan. And then someone came forward and said, well, that's a graveyard. That's a known graveyard. And it's not just a graveyard for the residential schools. It's not just a graveyard for the First Nation. It's a community graveyard that includes the bodies of both like white Canadians and First Nations. So why are we pretending that that's the same thing and adding it to this tally of, oh, these are all the dead children? When really what we're just talking about is like an abandoned graveyard, right? And again, it's like it goes to the narrative because people just see the headline, mass graves found. Lots of dead kids were killed, genocide happened. And that's the message that they take away. And it's just, from my perspective, creating so much division, so much hatred, so much like contrition and sadness. Like you see, they have this National Day of a Child where everyone wears orange. People just walk around with a feeling of like existential dread. Like, I hate my country. I hate Canada. I hate what we did. We're so awful. We murdered all these kids. And it's like, that's just such a bad governing ethos. Like that's such a bad thing to think about your country, even though the history of the entire world is full of awful events and wars and people murdering each other. Like that's like the history of the entire civilization of mankind. You know, Canada should be a story of like triumph. It's like, look at this amazing society that we built. We had built it through different groups coming together. We had the French, the English, the Scottish, the First Nations. They came up with these treaties. They built a civilization in a completely barren, like frozen tundra place that no one else in the world wanted. And we've created this amazing society that's so rich and so abundant and so well educated. And let's be the future. And like people from all over the world want to come here. Let's be like a tech innovative hub. Let's like be home to like the most successful people, the freest people, like strong communities, growing birth rate. Like let's find like a positive message that we can all rally around and be like, yes, I love Canada. They made a ton of mistakes and I hated that residential school program, but look where we are together now. We're rich and like we're solving all these problems. We're curing cancer and like, you know, AI is being developed here and Bitcoin or whatever, like we're doing blockchain. It just like Canada could have this like really exciting, youthful, energetic future. But instead it's like the things that we choose to focus on. It's like, all right, let's spend like another year talking about like how horrible things were in 1930. And this like horrible thing that may or may not have happened. It's like, okay, all right, if that's what you want to talk about, fine. But that's just not like an inspiring thing that I think that we should dwell on, waste our time. I think it's important, again, why we published that book, Grave Error, is to just try to correct the record. And you could read Grave Error, maybe read it and then come on my podcast and we'll have a debate about it. Because it sounds like, you know, you see things at different perspective in a different way. And it's possible to have a blind spot and I'm missing it. And that there is a real reason why we should be spending all this money trying to excavate and see what we find. I mean, I'm open to that possibility, but what I didn't like was like the mass, like gloom and the message that we're sending to kids that Canada commits genocide and we kill kids and that we tried to kill First Nations people, which I don't believe is true.
There's a lot there. First, let me say I have a lot of admiration for you for being willing to share and talk about this issue, because I can sympathize that it's a very difficult issue and you're likely not in the majority of people. And so it can be challenging to do those types of things. And I'm sorry that people had such a negative response to you bringing this information about, because initially my reaction was like, oh no, like you're going there. But then I really thought about the value of journalism, and it's to have these honest conversations. People aren't always going to love the story, but the story needs to be told in different perspectives, and analysis and information needs to come about. Just because something's sensitive doesn't mean that it shouldn't be covered like every other story. We should be respectful and kind and generous, and maybe give deference where deference is needed, but we need to have an honest conversation. And that's why I was excited to kind of have this conversation, not because I think I'm all right and you're all wrong, or you're all right and I'm all wrong, but because this is a complicated topic. It's about history, and we have to be able to have tough conversations about history. To your own point, I do think that working as a Native court worker, assisting Indigenous people through the legal system, their whole philosophy right now is, I'm a victim. The world has been terrible to me. They've been terrible to my parents. They've been terrible to my grandparents, and I've never been given a fair shot. Some of those I think are warranted. I think a lot of those claims that the world has not been fair to them and their parents and their grandparents, and they've experienced atrocities and intergenerational trauma is real. I think all of that's valid. The problem is, you have to wake up tomorrow morning and make your own decisions. And you can't just every time a problem arises, say that it's somebody else's fault and you're not going to take responsibility. It's why I'm a huge admirer of Jordan Peterson, is because he says you can come up with all the things that why your life sucks and why it's not fair, but you still have to wake up tomorrow morning and make your bed and live your life and try to improve things for people. So maybe there's less suffering. Maybe the world's a better place in the grand scheme of things. I do think that I support the research going on right now, because if there's one grave, if there's one unmarked grave, I want to know about it. And so I'd be willing to invest that money. It's not really my money, but I'd be willing to support those initiatives to get the final answer. And if there isn't evidence, then we can have closure on the issue. But I think it's important that we make sure that we know the answer to a question like that in order to have peace. Just like if you're looking into the Holocaust and those histories, you want to have definitive answers to some of these questions. But Candice, I have a great admiration for the work you do. I have a lot of respect for the challenges you face, bringing nuanced perspectives to complex issues. And it's why we've gone so much longer than a usual podcast does, is because I actually really like how you think about things. And when you walk through an issue, I don't think we get enough of that. I think it's really admirable the way you break things down and find ways to connect things. And I'm honored to have been able to share the time with you and to be able to learn from you, because I think you put a lot of work into making sure that you understand issues before you report on them. And I just find that work so valuable.
Well, I appreciate that. Can I just ask one question then, just to go back to, I know it's been a long time. I don't know if you have to go, because you asked me if I had any time. I have to go pick up my kids from school in half an hour or something. But okay, so you say that you want to do the excavations and you want to spend the money on the research to find closure, right? You're either going to find something and then we can talk about that and address it and properly mourn or whatever, or we'll find closure. Do you think that if they do, like, at what point with excavations and research and like is it going to take a decade? Is it going to take 50 years? Like will there actually be closure if you can't find what it is that you think you're looking for? And then the second question is, like, say the price tag for that is like $100 million or $500 million or $1 billion or $5 billion. Like, at what point do you think that maybe the money would be better spent, like on social programs or on education programs or on scholarships? Like, do you worry that this isn't perhaps the best use of public money? Because you said it's not your money, it's not my money. But I just wonder, like, if I were to say, okay, we're going to earmark $5 billion for unmarked grave research over the next 10 years, and I came to you and I said, Aaron, would you rather that $5 billion go towards like scholarships, or maybe go towards like building statues of Native heroes across like Canada, or like helping, like, kind of again to my positive message, like helping tell positive stories of warriors that did incredible things for First Nations, like it's a trade-off. Everything in government's trade-off. So do you think that $5 billion would be well spent on that research?
To the first question, I would say they've already identified specific sites. So there's no real risk of having like this, like we're researching everywhere in the oceans and anywhere that kind of comes up. I think this is already site specifics from what I'm hearing within like some of the researchers who are doing things here. They've already identified spots that they're looking, and we should get news within the next 6 months to a year. Like,
would you find closure? Like if they came back, because there was just an excavation that got finished a couple months ago and they found nothing.
Yeah.
So is that closure? Is it okay?
I think
they're
so.
Done. We're not gonna worry about that anymore. We're not gonna tell our kids that there were kids. We're not gonna tell our community that there were kids murdered at that site anymore because they didn't find it. So it's done.
I think that's closure.
Okay.
I think whether or not people want to report, to your own point, whether or not the CBC wants to write that story, I don't know. I think you'll be willing to write that story, which is again why I think the work you do and the work your team does is valuable, because some people, that's not going to get a lot of clicks, that's not going to get a lot of views, and it's not going to go along with the narrative we have. To the point you made a while back, I do think that the rate of Indian residential schools were as diverse as the population we have today. I know for a fact that I know elders who've been to the residential schools here, and I know that they weren't glossy, great places. I know people who have said, I'm not going to tell you what I went through. I'll tell you this little thing, but I'm not telling you the meat of it. I know that they tried to destroy our language. I know that they tried to destroy our culture. I've spoken to those people. And so I do think that, to your point, we need the good and the bad. I don't want to just see Indigenous people struggling on the streets and hearing about how they're overrepresented in the criminal justice system, how they're overrepresented in drug use, how they're overrepresented in like sexual exploitation. I don't want just that story. That's why I interview chiefs, elders, experts, community leaders, people who are making a difference, because I think we need both of those pieces. I need to understand the horrible things that happen so they don't happen again. And I also need to understand the good things and the people who are pioneering, like Chief Clarence Louie, who's trying to bring economic development to his community. I think you need that balance. And I do, to your second question about funding, I think you can do that with most things. You can go, do we want to fund the dentistry program, or could we get a better healthcare system and have more doctors in our city? Like, we can do that with anything. I just support the fact that whether or not it's private institutions funding the research or if it's government programs, I'm open to where the money comes from. But I do think that that's a worthwhile thing, because many families that I know of and many of the chiefs I've interviewed have this looming question: who was lost? What was lost, and how do we come to peace with that, and how do we get truth and reconciliation if we don't have the truth piece covered properly?
Because one of the things that I thought interesting, I interviewed one of the authors for the book Grave Error, and they basically described it like, we did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was like 10 years ago. And during that process, they came up with a list of all the names of the children that they believed were killed and died at residential schools. And they had that list, and it wasn't a very big list. It was like a couple of hundred names, right? And so that was kind of not dealt with, but addressed, and it came up, and we had that. And then now it's coming up again, but the numbers are like much, much, much higher. And so it's like, okay, so we tried to deal with it. We did have this discussion. We had this community, like it was raised. And I mean, I think it's unfortunate that many Canadians don't learn about residential schools. I learned about that when I was in high school. That was part of the school curriculum. But then I went to university in Edmonton, and I know that some of my friends didn't know about it. Like, they'd never heard about it. They never learned about it. So I think it's good that everybody's learning about it. I don't think that nobody was learning about it back then, because I did, but now more people, like I would say almost every Canadian probably now knows that there was a residential school program, and that it wasn't a very well-run program, and that there was a lot of, horrific things that happened at that school. But it's like, are we going to have to continue? Like, is every generation or every decade, is something like this going to come up, and we're going to have to like go through it again? Maybe it's just part of our history and what we have to do to have that reconciliation. But at a certain point, I just don't know that's productive. Anyway, I know we had a long conversation. We've gone through it all, but
the only thing I'll add is to your point about the 40 years of the conservatives getting the bad treatment. I mean, you can go to the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, the Truth and Reconciliation. We haven't had 100 years of going through these issues. We're at maybe 2 or 3 years of real solid research and understanding. So I don't think we're at the point where we need to go, whoa, we've done enough and we've done our part. We can put a close to the end of this book, because a lot of the people are still alive today.